Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Thursday, August 31st, 2023. I'm Donna Will, Professional Development Coordinator for the Maryland Department of Health's Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to our webinar on monitoring and follow-up guidance. On the panel today, we have Nicolette Paparadamas. She's the Director of Coordination of Community Services. Also, we have Leslie Thompson, the Assistant Director of Programs. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options to hear the webinar, by computer and phone. And if you look at the panel interface on your right, labeled audio, you can click either computer or phone to switch for the best option. We will be recording the webinar and posting this session on YouTube and the DDA website. Today's PowerPoint has also been uploaded as an attachment and is available for you to download in the webinar panel box. If you are listening by phone, you can request that it be emailed. Questions can be typed in the question or chat box in the webinar panel, and we will get to those towards the end of the presentation. So now I'd like to introduce Nicolette Paparadamas. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Donna. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for taking the time today to watch our webinar. And remember, it is being recorded. So please know that if you have an urgent matter, it will be posted for you to view at another time. If you all have any other questions, please make sure that you're entering them into the chat box and we'll be sure to answer them at the end of the webinar. So today we're talking about monitoring and follow-up. And we're going to refer to the guidance that we've recently released, the monitoring and follow-up guidance. So by the end of this training, you'll be able to understand DDA's requirements. That includes the frequency, how due dates are determined, and the essential activities related to monitoring and follow-up. We'll additionally go over how these requirements are built into LTSS and what to document in your monitoring and follow-up form as we review to use the consideration and confirmation sources to support the essential activities. We're also going to know the importance of the CCS's role and how each visit depends on who you're visiting and what you're monitoring for, as people and their situations differ. As we discuss the minimum requirements, we'll also take a peek into what these situations could look like. We're going to learn how families, service providers, and other chosen team members assist and contribute to this process, how to engage with them during your considerations and confirmation sources, while also including them as part of the action plan. Next slide, please. Leslie is going to go over the agenda with you all.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Happy Thursday. To echo what Nicolette said, appreciate you all being here today. I wanted to just kind of give you an overview of what the next hour will bring. So today, you know, it's really about, it's all things monitoring and follow-up, but we want to break things down for you today. So really, you know, we want to talk about the purpose of monitoring and follow-up and really understand and talk about how it's truly the foundation of the CCS's role. Then we're also going to talk about the minimum requirements that are a part of the monitoring and follow-up process. You know, and keeping in the back of your mind, you know, as we go through all of this today, that, you know, those requirements are in place to really ensure the people that you support are feeling supported and satisfied with their services in their lives. And then with that, the facilitation of the monitoring and follow-up process. It's very dependent on the person, and the follow-up actions are dependent on the situation. So not every monitoring and follow-up you do is going to look the same. And that's why we'll also talk about how to really use those considerations and confirmation sources that are in the guidance that Nicolette referenced as a guide to help better understand how things are really going for someone. And then if you identify something that does need an action plan, you know, talking with the person, their family, the provider, if they have one, and, you know, other important people in that person's life to come up with the appropriate next steps to help that person get where they want to be. Really altogether, we'll kind of close up with DDA and the QIO, just to really talk about our role in the process as well, and how we're here to support you and be helpful to you. And then of course, we've got some great review of LTSS functions that are built in to hopefully make things easier for you all, and a whole slew of resources that you may have already seen in the slide deck. And as always, we will have questions for time at the end. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Leslie. So what's the purpose of monitoring and follow-up? We're ensuring that people who are eligible for DDA are living a full life based on their needs and preferences. So CCSs are responsible for monitoring the implementation of a person's PCP for quality delivery service and identifying and helping mitigate risks related to the person's health and welfare. So in accordance to COMAR 10-948, monitoring and related follow-up activities include satisfaction of services, progress towards identified goals, health and safety, and their changes in need. So are they happy with their current supports? Are the supports in the plan adequate? Are they making any progress towards the goals that are listed in the PCP? Are they healthy and safe? Are we noticing that someone who's usually smiling and laughing to now be withdrawn? Are we recognizing that they might have fallen more frequently the past few months? And have there been any changes in need? So changes in need can encompass all of the aforementioned. However, CCS should also consider changes that require support in maintaining their Medicaid eligibility, or if there have been recent life changes, such as, hey, I want to propose and plan a wedding. So how are we supporting people, right, when just day-to-day life changes? We want to let you know that it is such a crucial role as CCSs are monitoring and following up. It's important because you're building trust. The monitoring just helps you build trust with people, their families, with the providers, you're enhancing relationships, you're addressing identified needs. When we're following these specific timelines and criteria, while there are requirements, right, the CCSs are ensuring that everyone receives the same individualized support that aligns with state and federal requirements. These exist to provide people with the best possible support. It provides people the ability to advocate for themselves. As CCSs empower individuals to voice their needs, their preferences, their aspirations. They're fostering a sense of ownership over their support journey. Monitoring and follow-up actions also foster trust among people, their families, providers. The trust is cultivated by developing relationships and following through on identified needs and preferences. It ensures that support remains relevant by accommodating to changes in people's needs. It provides the flexibility in the support journey. And through monitoring and follow-up, CCS creates a communication channel that facilitates that dialogue between people, their families, the providers, the CCSs, resulting in that collaborative approach to support and making sure it is reflective of the PCP. Next slide, please. So what are the requirements? So monitoring and follow-up is based on what CCS service a person is receiving. If you're ever unsure, you can confirm through the CCS agency assignment and LTSS. So there are 3 types of CCS services: waiting list, community, and transitioning. We'll go into more details about the minimum requirements of those in the next slide. Regulations require that all monitoring required by frequency, which we'll get into, is to be completed face-to-face with the person. It's not to be completed virtually or via the telephone. It's also critical to remember that it's your role to act as a third-party advocate for the implementation of the PCP. When receiving DDA-funded services, the visits must be in a different service setting each quarter, and it is both applicable to traditional and self-direction models. And we'll talk about this a little bit further. Next slide, please.
All right, so before Nicolette really dives into the requirements further, we just kind of want to reground everybody on these categories. So we're going to be talking about CCS service types, and I'm sure you're all very well aware there are 3 of those, right? So waiting list, community coordination, and transitioning coordination. The next column, monitoring frequency, that's how many in-person visits are needed. And again, that really depends on the service type the person is receiving. The next column, monitoring activities, that's really, again, based on what service type the person is receiving, and it's really boils down to what are you assessing? What is being assessed? And then lastly, the monitoring due date. Again, also very much depends on the service type, and I hope you're hearing the theme here. The service type is the key. But essentially when that monitoring is due by. So that is setting the stage for Nicolette to really dig deep into each of these, and I will pass it back to her.
Thank you, thank you. All right, next slide, please. So we're gonna start off with waiting list coordination. When waiting list coordination, excuse me, is when someone is on the waiting list. So people aren't actively utilizing DDA services. They're waiting for a waiver to become available for them to apply. A CCS might provide other available resources to support them with any current needs they have, such as applying to other government programs that might fit their current needs. And it's also an opportunity for the CCS to get to know the person and understand what their strengths, goals, and ambitions are to live a fulfilling life. In preparation for the waiver, as they're on a waiting list, the CCS answers any questions or concerns and provides resources to support the eligibility process. And when a waiver becomes available, the CCS assists the person and their family in applying. So the waiting list, it depends on the priority category assessment. So as we were saying, you know, each of those categories is dependent on the service type, but in this specifically, when someone's receiving a waiting list, is receiving waiting list coordination services, the priority category has a lot to do with the frequency. So people in crisis resolution have been determined to be in a situation that requires more support, as they live as, their health and safety might be jeopardized. So the CCS is to monitor monthly for the first 90 days. You want to ensure that the person has the supports in place during this critical period. And then after those 90 days, it's monthly. People added to crisis prevention means the person is or will be in a health or safety crisis within the next year. So the CCSs are required quarterly visits to ensure the person continues to be healthy and safe. And then current request means the person needs or wants services, but health and safety isn't the immediate issue, so visits are annual. But it is important to remember that as you're monitoring and follow up during while someone's on the waiting list, if there's any changes in needs around someone's health and safety, it could mean that the CCS is completing a priority category assessment and communicating with their regional office's eligibility team if further clarification is needed, which then the visits would be applicable to those priority categories. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing I didn't mention. What you're monitoring for while someone is on the waiting list is, of course, their health and safety and any changes in need. And we'll get into those a little bit more deeper as we have some examples for you. But what's really important here as well is that the due date of your monitoring and follow-up form is the date that the priority category assessment was finalized. And that's what's going to generate your monitoring and follow-up forms. Okay, next slide. All right. As Nick says, I'm going to quote Nick, this is where the sauce hits the pasta, or as I like to say, the feta meets the salad. But as we speak about community coordination, this applies to people who are both in traditional and self-direction, as we mentioned earlier. So when an agency is assigned community coordination, the person is receiving DDA services. They're accessing the waiver. They have waiver services. So the CCS must complete in-person visits in the setting that the service is being provided. With that, it's important to know that the person's goals, it's important to know the person's goals because that's going to help determine where the visits should take place. So for example, if someone has personal supports to promote their desire to independently shop, learn how to order their own meal and how to fold their laundry, then the CCS can visit the person at the mall. And the next quarter, they can meet them at a restaurant. And another quarter, they can either meet the person at their home or the laundromat. So wherever the person, it feels comfortable, you could still recognize or monitor the service in a laundromat, right? So we're going to get creative because we've come to understand, right, that visits can be a challenge, especially when it could be in the person's own home. So remember, you're monitoring in the setting of the service. So work with the person and their family with the location that the service is provided in. It's important to schedule your visits ahead of time and to have a backup plan in case it doesn't work out. If the person and their family has a health and safety concern, work with them to see what would make them more comfortable. Would meeting on the porch be better, or a visit in the community? What do the medical professionals advise, or what do they do when they visit them? So if you find that you have scheduled visits with people and their providers, and they're concerned that they might show up, if you're concerned that they might not show up, ask for the staff's contact information or follow up the day before to remind them that the visit's scheduled. If you're having difficulty after using all of these, creative approaches, and you've spoken with your supervisor, contact the regional CCS squad for further assistance, and we'll help support you through this. Next, and sorry, I forgot about that due date again. It's based on the annual plan date and quarterly thereafter. All right, thank you. You could go to the next slide. So transitioning coordination. Transitioning coordination. We want people living and integrated in their communities. So that's essentially transitioning coordination. People who are admitted into a state-operated facility or living in a nursing home and have plans to move back into the community because they're clinically ready require transitioning coordination. Some examples are the Holly Center, the Potomac, the SET, or PHA, the Behavioral Health Administration. So these visits are monthly for the first 90 days and then quarterly once they're in those services, right? So pay attention. People transitioning back into those communities from these facilities are paid close attention to. So as you're monitoring while you're providing transitioning coordination, pay attention to their health and safety support needs. We want to pay close attention to, to this because we don't want them to return to the facility. Of course, we have other activities as well, but as they're transitioning and you're applying, we want to plan for a successful discharge. So as you're monitoring and following up, a part of that discharge planning meetings, communicate with the planners, with the discharge planners, and anyone else on the discharge team so that when the person is ready for discharge, you can find and recommend the best provider to support their needs. The due date of the forms are based on the date the CCS agency was assigned. So when someone's assigned transition coordination, they're going out and supporting the person right away, and those visits are monthly thereafter, and then quarterly. All right, Leslie. Next slide.
All right. So it's important to remember that what Nicolette just reviewed in depth here are the minimum requirements, right? So that does not mean that those are necessarily the only times that a CCS should complete the monitoring and follow-up process. We're all human, our lives change from day to day, and for some people that could mean they need a little more support from their CCS from time to time. So, remember in those types of situations, they are not needed based on frequency. So they're not as required, or they're not necessarily required to be in person, like, Nicolette spoke about with quarterly. These monitoring and follow-up visits can be done virtually or over the phone. However, when they do occur, the required monitoring and follow-up within that cycle still needs to be completed in person. So we'll just give you a quick example here. So let's say that someone was on the waiting list as a current request, and a CCS has completed their monitoring for the year, okay? However, the CCS is contacted by DDA as they received a report that the person is now homeless. So a CCS then follows up with the person, provides resources that could best support them currently, whether it's a local shelter or helping the person locate family members that they may be able to connect with. The CCS changes their priority category to crisis resolution, is then placed on a waive, and then supports the person in applying for the waiver. So this would be a manually added monitoring and follow-up form that the CCS would complete in LTSS to include those recommendations and those action steps that you took. So just remember, each situation is different. Every person is different. A person could have a few more health and safety concerns, than another person, or whatever, what have you. Like I said earlier, life changes day to day. So this was just one example, but you'll note on the slide, there are several different situations that you may need to do an additional monitoring and follow-up. Next slide, please.
All right. So now that we know the requirements, how do we conduct a successful monitoring and follow-up visit? As a third-party advocate, you want to know the person's perspective. Treat this as more of a conversation. You can use the considerations and confirmation sources that are in the guidance, the monitoring follow-up guidance, to prepare for your visit and understand the essential monitoring follow-up activities. So, excuse me, when you recognize an area that might need an action plan during your monitoring and follow-up visit, you're using your CCS skill sets, right? They come into play. Do you need to facilitate a PCP? Do you need to get more feedback from other team members? But it really depends on who you're working with and the outcome of your follow-up, because you can even provide community resources to include things like that you might have seen postings for, like a yard sale, local event, job fairs, marathons, etc., free museums. So you don't have to hear from someone they have an interest in something. If you're referring community resources, you can just bring them up because it might pique their interest too. So sometimes if we don't know about something, we just might not talk about it. But when you are following up and you have that action plan, you want to ensure that you're closing that loop. So following back up is essential. You want to make sure that they are satisfied and it's meeting their needs. So preparing for your visit, first and foremost, above all, make sure that you feel safe and comfortable. Make sure you feel safe and comfortable. Make sure that you have a cell phone with you. Let your supervisor know. Ask them to join you. Let another colleague in that area, if another colleague's in the area, let them know that you're around there. We want you to feel safe and supported. So if you find that you might need more assistance because you don't feel comfortable and you've spoken with your supervisor, reach out to the DDA to help facilitate a safe environment. So scheduling, preparing for your visit, we talked about scheduling. We know there's challenges, right? Especially in someone's home. So we talked about how you're visiting in the service setting in a different setting each quarter. So plan ahead and have a backup plan. Don't wait until when the monitoring and follow-up is due. Give yourself time and schedule ahead. Now, if someone's on the waiting list and they don't have services, remember to work with the person and their family. If they're current requests, you minimally have to meet with them in person once a year. When you first connect with them, ask them what time of the year would work best for them to hold the in-person meeting visit. If other family and friends living in the home are immunocompromised, would the summertime be a better time to connect in person so that you can meet outside? So have these, have these conversations ahead of time before you make the visit so that you can best work with people, their families, their housemates, whoever it may be. We want to be respectful as we're working with people, since everyone is different. So another example, as we're talking about scheduling and you know, some of the challenges, I kind of wanted to just give the example of maybe employment. So if someone's working and you're looking to follow up there, work with the provider to schedule something ahead of time, right? So that management office, with the management office where the person works. I know that it might really feel intimidating, especially if someone, let's say, for example, is working in a federal government building. But know that your presence is just as important as the follow along supports. You're supporting the person meeting their goals to be a successful employee, right? And any business would want a successful employee. So if you feel uncomfortable, just discuss it with your supervisor. Speak with us at DDA for more assistance if something is just not working out. Before you visit someone, preparing is also gathering the tools that you need. And if this is the first time you're meeting someone who might be on the waiting list, you can consider using some of the Charting the Life courses tools to support your conversation so that you can get to know them. You could even provide it to them ahead of time so that they can also be prepared for a conversation. When someone is in services, right, review their PCP, review their goals. What services do they currently have? How are they being provided? What's in the PCP? What does it say? How are they supposed to be provided? What does their community employment goals look like? What's important to them? What's important for them? Review the risks. What are the mitigations in place, if any? And any of the approved restrictions. These are going to be really important as you utilize the considerations and confirmation sources so that you can better understand if the person's satisfied and receiving the supports that are noted in their PCP, that they're healthy, safe, and it's going to help you identify if there are any changes in the person's need. So be prepared to have that conversation with the person. And then also important, breathe and self-reflect. Be mindful of how you're feeling. Bring yourself back to the present. Recenter yourself. Remember, you're making a difference in someone's life. It's also really important that you're going into someone's personal space. And we all choose to live differently. So if you ever feel unsure or uncomfortable at something, talk with your supervisor about it. Understanding considerations and confirmation sources. So we're looking to understand the what and the why when we're monitoring and follow up. Start with where the person is when you meet with them and where they want to begin. Let them guide you. You can understand someone by observing. How do they look today? Both physically and emotionally. Let the person even show you anything new that they might have learned that might be relevant to their goals. Listen to what they're saying and what they're not saying. Stay grounded. Ask open-ended questions. So you're going to get a lot more with an open-ended question than a closed-ended one, right? Like a yes or a no response. You want to hear more about what they think. So asking open-ended questions help with that. You might even need to rephrase a question and seek further clarification, especially if you do need to go beyond a single answer response like no or I don't like it. Break it down further, and reflect what they might be feeling or what they're trying to express, what they're trying to say when they're telling you these things. You could say, what I'm hearing you say is, right? So once you have that information to answer the questions for your activities, you've identified, what items, what are the follow-up items, what do I as a CCS need to do now? So work with the team, figure out, what are the action steps? What needs to be completed? When should it be completed by? And then you're checking back in. You want to know when it might be completed by as you're working with the team to see if it actually helped the person and resolve their needs. If it didn't work, maybe there isn't a need anymore for it, or maybe we have to come up with another action plan. But whatever it is, you want to ensure that you're closing that loop. And then, of course, lastly, you're recording and you're documenting. So whatever your style is, whether you take notes or you like to go back and, after your monitoring visit and go onto the computer and enter it right away, whatever your style, if you are looking to take notes, we do recommend, you know, ask the person if it's okay, because it might make them feel uncomfortable if they just see, you know, taking notes and not really paying attention to them. They might close off. So just have that conversation with them and say, hey, is it okay if I just jot some things down while we're talking? You might see a big difference in how much they're opening up. So of course, whatever your style is, the last step after everything is entering it into the monitoring and follow-up LTSS form. Remember those due dates, right? And know yourself. Those due dates that we were talking about. Get them ahead of time. We're not waiting until, you know, that due date. We want to make sure it's, you know, entered and submitted then. All right. Yeah. Okay, next slide, Leslie. Leslie's going to talk to you about satisfaction with services and that activity, what it's going to look like.
All right, thanks, Nicolette. So two of the main things we're looking at, right, when we're doing monitoring and follow-up. So is the person receiving services as described in their PCP, and are they satisfied with those services? And then are they making progress towards the goals that are identified in their PCP? So if you look at the slide, you'll see this might look familiar to you. This is really the same format that we used in the community settings questionnaire guides, considerations and confirmation sources chart. Hopefully you all pull that out somewhat regularly for reference. Because monitoring and follow-up is person-centered focus, you know, and as is the nature of our work, we use the same framework for each essential activity to support you when answers aren't so clear. As we all know, there's a lot of gray area in what we do. So sometimes we need some of those prompts or nudges to help us, you know, kind of work through things. So you should really always be asking the person receiving services, is the person receiving services as described in their PCP, and are they satisfied, right? Are they making progress towards those goals? Those are really kind of, they're combined in under this same section because they really do kind of go hand in hand. So that's why it's important to know what someone's goals and outcomes are as listed in their PCP. And make sure, you know, you're really looking to understand how's it going for someone based on these considerations and confirmation sources. An example for you. So a person might have requested assistive technology to support their communication, and they need staff support to teach them, support them how to use the device. So in visiting and doing your monitoring and follow-up, do you see that it is in fact being used? Is it working? Is the device functional for the person? Have they made progress since you last visited? Or if this is the first time, you know, can the person show you something cool or, you know, new that they learned on the device and how to use it? You know, are the staff supporting the person when they are using it, if they need it, if they need that support? Does the person show interest in it? You know, if not, you know, ask about if there have been any barriers, you know, and you can ask questions about those things with staff. You can review activity logs. Ask the person, you know, ask them if they've run into issues with it. Maybe it's as simple as, you know, there's an issue with the charger not working, so they haven't been able to keep it charged and use it. You know, it might not just be that they're not interested. So really thinking about those types of questions can help you understand more what's going on. Then, you know, after the visit, you can even follow up with other members of the team, you know, their family, friends, you know, the people that are important to them, the people they've chosen to be on their team, to seek additional information or clarity if you need to. If someone is receiving personal supports or other EVV services, you can also check the EVV services rendered report to view what staff attendance has looked like in the past quarter. You may have inquiries from ISS2, and when My LTS is live, which is going to be awesome, the person will also be able to flag services for you to review, which is a cool feature. So you can use all of these sources to support your conversations and your work with the person when asking about their satisfaction of services and the progress on their goals. Next slide, please. All right, Nicolette, I'll hand it over to you for health and safety.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. I lost my mouse there. It stopped working for a minute. So, health and safety. Again, it's really important to prepare, observe, and listen. So, you might be visiting someone, for example, who is at risk of falling. When you see them, do you notice that they have more bruises? Ask them about it, ask staff, review the incident reports. These are all things that are on the considerations, right? But we're using this in this example to kind of put it in perspective of the work that in the lens, in your lens. So how have they had more falls recently? You want to consider if, you know, when you're observing, does the environment look safe? Are there broken stairs? So when you're using these answers, right, you then know how to facilitate the conversation for that action plan. So do we have a follow-up with a specialist to check on why this is occurring more frequently? Or do we have any services that might help fix the stairwell so that they don't fall? So we're talking about these things with the team and trying to find the best resolution to prevent this person from falling again, right? We want to mitigate these risks. We want to keep them healthy and safe. And of course, we don't want it to happen. So even if we just see a broken stairwell, we see it and we know next steps. We have to plan for something. And it might be that sometimes someone doesn't even know, you know, that could be a service for them. So having you see something like that is really important because you, the CCS, are helping them with understanding what resources and services are available for them to meet these goals as well. I think that's really important to remember. You know, we don't always have to hear it from someone. That's what the importance of monitoring and follow-up also offers. So, of course, remember, if there are ever any concerns regarding health and safety of someone, follow the PORI guidelines. And just so you know, there is going to be a guidance on the plan of correction coming soon, which will include the roles and responsibilities of a CCS. Now we're going to talk about change in need on the next slide. And this is where we had mentioned earlier, but just to reiterate, it's all things are going to be considered here, right? Including their health and safety, their satisfaction of services, their progress towards goals. They're essentially, you know, there is going to be kind of like that change in need. It's applicable here. But what we also want to check in on is anything else someone might be living through that we might not think about regularly, right? So consider what successes have the family made that could lead to an impact in someone's life that could be incorporated into their overall trajectory, right? You're recognizing that, hey, this really works for someone. This is a strength. We can use that while we're person-centered planning for them. You can even bring up, right, we talked about earlier, things that are happening in their local community. You can recommend to the person what you've seen, whether it is that park, right, and elicit new interest. That would both nail those recommendations and changes in need. So it's just, it could be opening up to new ideas as well. You're supporting them with any gaps in eligibility. You're understanding that there are new changes in progress that could alter the direction of what they need. Okay, the next example, the next slide, Leslie is going to give you an example from A to Z about how to put this framework in place.
Thanks, Nicolette. So yeah, we've gone over everything, and now it's important to really kind of tie it to a real life example that you might encounter when you're out doing your monitoring and follow-up. So you complete a monitoring and follow-up visit, and the person expresses they're not satisfied with services. And the way you have kind of come to that conclusion or initial conclusion is that they mentioned that they're bored during the day, right? That could be a hint to you that, maybe you need to dig a little deeper. So you want to really understand what's going on there. So ask the person, ask the family, the provider, to really try and figure out why they're not satisfied with their supports. What specifically is the person not satisfied with? Do they not like their schedule? Do they, either how the schedule is set up or maybe the activities on the schedule? Maybe it is just the actual service that they don't like. Is this something that's been reported by the person before, either to you or another member of the team? Is the provider aware that there's a provider involved? Are they aware that the person is bored and dissatisfied with their services? And also, what has the team tried thus far to really ensure satisfaction? And then really looking at, as a CCS, using those confirmation sources, whether it be at a day hab program or at their home or whatever the setting is, using those confirmation sources to make sure you have the best understanding you can of where that person is at and why they're feeling that way. So you've gathered all the information you can, and you feel like you have a pretty good understanding of what's going on. So now we need to talk about action steps. How can we help this person get to where they want to be? So what actions will you as a CCS take once you understand that situation better? Maybe that means a team meeting needs to be scheduled to talk about, options and next steps. How are the issues identified, the areas, how will those areas be addressed where the person has identified they're not satisfied? I know I mentioned when we're talking about understanding, maybe the person doesn't like their schedule. Do they need to put a new schedule together? Maybe they want more input on their schedule of what they do for the day. Does the person ultimately want a new provider? Maybe they just want to work with a different staff. It could be a plethora of things. So then it's important to act on those things. So it's really important that we, document the steps in the monitoring and follow-up form, like what action steps are going to be taken. Think about how, who, or well, more what first, right? Who's going to be responsible for it and how it's going to happen. Discuss as a team what the time frame is. Maybe the service implementation plan needs a revision. Maybe that's, one of the action steps. Talk about as a team, collaborate to determine what is a reasonable time frame for that to be revised. What's a reasonable time for a person to work with someone to develop a new schedule? What actions and monitoring also will take place to ensure satisfaction between now and the next monitoring? Because you're really going to want to close that loop. So you'll see that there, loop closure. So what action steps were taken? Was a service implementation plan revised? Where were those action steps and documented? Is the person satisfied with their supports now? Ask those questions of the person. When are making sure you're checking in again to make sure that, things have been resolved or revised or whatever, whatever wording you want to use. And then review your monitoring and follow-up form to follow back up on what action steps were established and the timeframes to which it was completed. And then we're going to look at that a little bit more in the next few slides, but really think about it as just closing the loop. I think that's a good visual to keep in mind when you're thinking about this process. Next slide, I'll hand it back to Nicolette.
All right. So you're monitoring and follow up and you find that there's a change in need. The person mentioned they need more money, right? So this would be a change in need. That's that essential activity that you're looking for. So you're looking to understand, They say they need more money. Well, why do you need more money or want more money? What sources of money do you currently have? If they're in services, right? Like, well, you know, what's going on with, you know, your competitive integrated employment, et cetera. The action steps based off of what you understood and what the person responded with. You're going to talk with them. You're going to talk with the team. You're going to discuss the things that they could do to get more money. You know, all right, we're going to work. If they don't have a job, we can start saving. We can, you know, just other types of brainstorming ideas with everyone to be able to resolve, you know, what that person's need is. We're going to support them in identifying financial resources. That could be another action plan. You know, there's a savings account we can consider. There's this job that's available. There are these types of benefits that we could help you apply for, and so forth. And then, of course, after you divide, you've come up with an action step, an action plan with everyone. You're closing that loop. So, you know, is that job, the new job, working out for you? How is it looking? Do you feel like you have more money now? And if they say yes, that's great. And you're closing up that action plan. You know, you've satisfied the need, essentially. So the next slide, we're going to talk about what you should include in your monitoring and follow-up form. So we're referring to the monitoring and follow-up form in LTSS, right? So can we go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So, right, we're looking at, are they satisfied with supports? Do they have any changes in need? Are they healthy and safe? And are they achieving those goals? You want to make sure that those details are in that monitoring and follow-up form. Use those confirmation sources to get your answers, right? What did you, so write in the details, right? If they're not healthy and safe, why? How did you find that out? Was it because of incident reports? Are they having more falls? And then you're including what those action steps are, right? How are we going to resolve in maintaining that, maintaining their health and safety? What does the team need to do next to help the person from falling into this situation again that is jeopardizing their health and safety? And then checking back in on it, right? We say close the loop, checking back in. Is that action plan working? And that's closing the loop. So we just want to make sure that whatever we're finding as we're monitoring and follow up, we've got a good plan working with the team, and we're making sure that it's working for the person. And then what we should also remember, and we mentioned it earlier, but with that due date, the form needs to be submitted by the due date noted in LTSS. We don't have to wait until the due date, right? But it should be submitted by the due date. That's what that due date means. All right, next slide. Now we're going to talk about some monitoring and follow-up frequently asked questions. So we're talking about the action steps. So say you put everything into your monitoring and follow-up form, and you see on the bottom that there are some actions, right? It says pending recommended action. So after you submit it, you see this under the status. What this means is that as you are entering your form, there's been an identified issue, right, of whether it's their dissatisfaction of a service, or if they're not meeting their goals, if there's a health or safety risk, whatever the concern is, there needs to be an action plan. So what we could do with LTSS, this is serving you to help remind you that something needs to be followed back up on. So you could go back in, and anytime to this form, you click view, go into the form to the bottom with all of those actions that need to be taken. And as we mentioned, when we're closing the loop, has that been completed? Is this working out for the person? And or does the person even still need it or not? Because maybe their need changed. When you hit complete and you're submitting it, that pending recommended action is removed. So this is serving as a support to to the closing of the loop of things after you're completing your form. So after, let's say, even the due date, I just want to be clear, you could even still go into that form to, you know, say that that action has been completed. So the next slide. So let's say I wanted to kind of go over the due dates, right, and what they mean. It's literally the last day a monitoring and follow-up visit should be completed and submitted by, right? So it's similar to the auto extend. You're not depending on that 15-day monitoring form extension. The period in which you should monitor and complete your monitoring is from the time this new form generates and any day up until that due date is listed in that monitoring follow-up list. So for example, we're looking at quarterly. If you see on the bottom, it's 11/13/2022. Once that was submitted in November of 2022, the new form generates, which is due February 13th, 2023. Anytime in that 3-month period, because that person is in services, if it's a quarterly visit, then the monitoring can be done at any time. And again, this date is based off of the PCP. It's quarterly based off of the PCP. So you can determine when visits are needed also according to that. What we also see here is the annual. And what I really want to point out is that the annual was for when the person was on the waiting list, right? So you see the first line, it says annual 2/5/2022 on the bottom. That person has since had another form because they were still on the waiting list. That due date, because it's 365 days, just by looking at this, we could say, okay, it must have been a current request. That monitoring form was due by 2/5/2023. Now it looks as if, right, we're seeing it's in the same month as that quarterly. But if you remember, that person had 365 days beginning February 2022 to complete at least one monitoring visit in person. Doesn't mean they had to complete it in February 2023. So I want to make sure that that's understood, because it could look, right, and I've heard this a lot, that it might be a duplicate form. It's not. It was for a different time, right? The person was on the waiting list. Now we're in the 1, 2, 3, third quarterly visit. We want to see how services are going in this visit, and it's due by February 13th, 2023. And if, okay, all right. Next slide. So in April, there was an LTSS update. It was per the request of the agencies, the CCS agencies, to have an add button. What's really important to remember is that they won't have a due date set by the system. And when we were talking about monitoring and follow-up visits that can occur at any time, meaning, hey, you got a call and because someone might be in the hospital and you're going to follow up to make sure everything's okay, what services might need to be put in place so they don't, you know, end up in the hospital again, or, you know, whatever might have happened to the person, and you're helping with the next steps in the action plan, you're adding it here. That's when you would add that button. There is no due date because it comes at any time. And it's completed outside of those minimum requirements, right? So you could be calling the person that might be in the hospital. I mean, however you can get in contact with them or follow up and support them. You're monitoring to make sure that they're okay, and you're following up to make sure that whatever next steps are put in place, they're healthy and safe, and they're satisfied with everything. It's really important, right? It's that third party advocate. So I just wanted to mention that, you know, this is to be completed when it's outside of your monitoring minimum requirements. And you could use that add button functionality. We don't want to use this in replacement of the auto-generated forms. The auto-generated forms are generated specifically according to what, what visit is specific to those due dates to help support, the organization of your visits. So I hope that helps explain when to use the add button. But when you see a generated form, that is your in-person monitoring form to complete. All right, next slide. Now we're going to talk about DDA and the QIO. I'm going to talk about the CCS Squad. The CCS Squad, we hear about the CCS Squad a lot, right? What do? Well, they're supporting the regionally assigned CCS agency's leadership team. They're providing data specifically regarding monitoring and follow-up forms that are near their due date and those that might not have been completed. We're working closely with those agency leaderships in order to collaborate, identify any trends, and offer technical assistance. As we were mentioning earlier, if there are any concerns about following up in person at someone's home or whatever have you, reach out to the team and we could support and offer that type of assistance. We want to collaborate and support you as you're helping people. So another example is, let's say they're duplicate forms. We were just reviewing the dates. CCS could help you identify, is it a duplicate form? What's the next steps on resolving it? Does an LTSS, is it an LTSS glitch or not? Following back up to make sure that the system is working right and supporting you, even if you're not sure. You and your supervisor, of course, aren't sure. Hey, what's going on with these forms? Can you take a second look at this? We're also, this squad's also available if, there isn't, you're not able to come to an agreement as you're coming up with an action plan, right? So say a provider and the team are just disagreeing. You could reach out to your CCS squad at your regional office, and they could help coordinate and facilitate a meeting to support the facilitation and next steps for that person. Referring to COMAR regs, the regional office, the regional director is there for mediation and conflict resolution. So we do want you to know that, while there are times there are disagreements and we want to get to that yes, if it comes to that absolute necessary, DDA could support and facilitate the conversation. And then, of course, we're also working with our regional colleagues to support any unique circumstances. So while you're reaching out to your CCS squad, if there's something that's within another department, we're working alongside one another to come up with the best resolution. And speaking of another department, we also have the quality enhancement, right? So how does quality enhancement come into place? So it comes in when we're discussing anything DDA PORI related, internal investigation incidents. If you're not sure and you've spoken with your supervisor, the ROQE team can support you and your supervisor with any needed clarifications. Sometimes it's hard to report information that's not positive about someone you have a good working relationship with. We know that's not easy, but remember, you're mandated reporters and you're ensuring the health and safety people first. People also have the right to choose a new CCS if they no longer find it's working for them. And there is also a statement in PORI about freedom of retaliation. Therefore, your agency shall have measures in place to reduce the potential of any retaliation of reporting. And of course, let the regional office know how you feel. Now we're going to talk about the QIO and Liberty Healthcare TCM reviews. Leslie's going to go into those details and how Liberty is here to support us.
All right, so all of you are probably well aware at this point that we have a quality improvement organization that we've been working with for the better part of a year now, Liberty Healthcare. And they, as part of their work, are conducting quarterly targeted case management or TCM reviews to assess, DDA standards related to monitoring and follow-up. Results of those reviews are shared each quarter with DDA and the CCS agencies. So you are getting that information. And then the CCS agencies are also receiving detailed reports on the randomly selected participant case files that were reviewed for that specific CCS agency. So those reports include the participant's LTSS ID, and then the results of each indicator question. And then, met, so that means whether it met standards, unmet standards, or wasn't applicable. And those are provided along with the justification notes on why that determination was made, in addition to some quality improvement recommendations. So a summary of the number and percentage of cases reviewed that either met or did not meet standards is also provided in that detailed report. The information in those reports can really provide CCS agencies with detailed information on the compliance with the standards and the quality of CCS monitoring and follow-up activities. The quality recommendations also provide some really good options for opportunities that can be made or improvements that can be made to not only ensure compliance with standards, but really just overall improve person-centered practices. DDA can utilize the CCS agency's specific and overall statewide findings to enhance policies, guidance, and really provide, more effective support to CCS agencies for improved outcomes over time. So it's very, very useful data, useful information. And we hope that, those of you that have seen those reports have really had that experience as well, because ultimately it's, helping all of us support one another better and do the best work we possibly can. With that, I will pass it back to Nicolette.
All right, thank you. Resources. So the last slide, well, not completely last, but the last slide is the resources. Everything we've discussed today, you could refer to these resources at any time. I would definitely take a look at the monitoring and follow-up guidance if you haven't already. Most of what we spoke about is in that monitoring and follow-up guidance. So take a look if you have any other questions or need further clarity, of course, as we're about to review it, but it's also a good guidance for you to review. It's made for you, just for you. That considerations and confirmations tool is found in the monitoring follow-up guidance. So this PowerPoint is actually linked in the handouts, just as a reminder, and you should be able to click the link. If you can't, it is on the DDA CCS webpage for your convenience. Now, the questions. Leslie is going to help facilitate the questions. So I'm ready.
All right, and so I know we're already over time, but there are some really great questions in here. So we're going to try to get to several of them, and then, whatever we can't get to, we will absolutely follow up with answers, just, in the interest of being respectful of everyone's time. So, all right, first question, how do we do different settings with self-directed participants? Monitoring in different settings.
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Sure. How does a CCS do monitoring in different settings with someone who is in self-directed services?
Where are the services being provided? So if there's only one service setting, meaning it's in the home, then that's the only setting. If they have multiple goals in different service settings, then you're looking into each of those settings. It could be different, multiple services. It could just be one service, but in different service settings. So you're looking at what is their goal, where are they looking to achieve this, and then you're providing monitoring and follow-up in that setting.
All right, the next question, the person who asked it left, but I gotta imagine there's more people thinking about this. So I'm gonna ask it anyway. So what if a person doesn't want to meet in all of their service settings? For example, if a person doesn't want to meet while they're working and receiving employment services.
So there is, again, you're looking at what are the other goals in service settings. Someone could have 10 goals. Are you going to be able to meet in 10 different service settings if they are all in different service settings? No. So you're going to have to work with, what's in their PCP, what works for them, what works for the person, where would they feel comfortable? And if all in all you have further questions, reach out to your CCS support team and your supervisor so that we could help you figure that out.
All right, and I'm just going to add to that quick too. I think that employment example is a good example. Not everybody's going to want somebody to come, meet them or check on them or whatever you want to call it while they're working. Getting creative, like Nicolette said, maybe you meet up with them right after work. Maybe something like that, just so they're still in that kind of frame of mind. That's another option.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually,
Oh,
I'm going to add to it because that's really exactly like, and again, it depends on what their goals are. And that's a great example to add to, if it is part of their goal is to get to work on time, it's you know what I mean? You could also monitor, all right, well, are we in the home? Are we waiting outside? What is that goal? Where can we have this discussion? How is it going for you? So it's really to the person. Remember, we're saying it's really specific to each person, but what you really have to think about is that goal and get creative with them. So thanks, Leslie.
yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm going to hit you with another one. So for transition coordination specifically, are monthly visits required for the first 3 months upon assignment to the CCS agency, or monthly once they transition to the community?
It's both. So it's first 90 days is monthly. And then after that, when they're transitioned into the community, then it's quarterly.
All right, there's the next couple questions I'm going to kind of group together, and I can answer these, Nicolette, and you feel free to add. So, and I did answer this in the chat, but in case anyone didn't see it, the question was, back on slide 10, we talked about different other scenarios when a monitoring and follow-up visit should occur. And the person asked, does that mean there is a new requirement for in-person visits in these situations? And I responded with, that while it's still kind of the same monitoring and follow-up basic process, those additional monitoring and follow-up situations do not require an in-person visit. I think Nicolette noted, or maybe I can't remember at this point which one of us talked about it, but it can be done on the phone or virtually, those kind of in-between visits. And to piggyback off of that, someone asked if DDA could provide a list of examples of when those additional monitoring and follow-up situations would need to happen outside of those pre-populated due dates. That's a great question. That would be a mighty, mighty long list, and I think it would be pretty difficult for us to capture everything. But I think the best way for you to think about it is anytime there's, somewhat of a significant life event. So the person moves. That's kind of an easy one, right? The person moves. Maybe someone important to them in their life passes away. Maybe they have a baby. Maybe they get married. Maybe they have an unplanned hospitalization. Those kinds of things that are sort of out of the everyday norm for a person that could have a significant effect on their lives are great opportunities to check in with them and complete, this sort of additional monitoring and follow-up. And Nicolette, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
I do, yeah. And in the monitoring and follow-up guidance, we do list examples and how to further think about it. So we do give those examples, and just as we did in the slide here too. But like Leslie said, it really depends on a person. I mean, you know, we want to make sure when we're saying about it, monitoring and follow-up is just, it happens all the time, right? It's your job. You're following up on someone when something, you know, connects with you about something that you might need to call back up on with the person. Because let's say, you know, you're finding out from a team member that someone may have had, you know, I hate to say, like an incident of some sorts. So you're entering and you're documenting in the monitoring and follow-up forms for these incidents, right? That's where those documentations are coming place when you're following up. What is, you know, what happened? What's that look like? And this is where, you know, it would be reflective in your case notes, your activity notes, like, hey, this is the work that was done when we're talking about, you know, that connection of reaching out to the person because someone had let you know that XYZ happened, and then you're entering into your form, all right, this is what happened, you know, health and safety was at risk, this is the action plan moving forward, and then you're checking back in on it to make sure that they are furthermore healthy and safe. Again, just an example, but I'm just trying to help connect those dots too.
All right, thanks, Nicolette. I think we're over time. So I think we do have a few more questions, but in the interest of, again, respecting folks' time, we will follow up with answering the remaining questions in the FAQ. I don't want to speak for Nicolette, but so I'll let her step in here in a second, but just want to thank all of you for joining today, for asking such great questions. It's always a pleasure to be able to sit and talk with you all and you know, go through the things that are going on in the DDA world. Nicolette, you can close us out if you want.